The low, guttural growl of the heavy diesel engines cut through the silent, frozen night like a jagged knife. It was a sound Elara had not heard since that fateful morning months ago, a sound that brought the bitter taste of fear to the back of her throat. She stood by the frosted window of her cabin, her frail, weathered hand gripping the rough wood of the window frame. Outside, the thick, swirling fog parted just enough to reveal the blinding glare of high-beam headlights. Two massive off-road trucks, their tires wrapped in heavy iron chains, violently tore through the pristine snow crust, coming to a sudden, aggressive halt right at the edge of her property line. The Poachers, the very men who had ripped Kaelen from his mother and tossed him aside like garbage, were back. They were seeking refuge from the incoming blizzard, or worse, they were looking for whatever they could take from an isolated, vulnerable, old woman. Elara did not panic. The harshness of the Siberian wilderness had long ago stripped her of the luxury of fear. She turned slowly away from the window. The cabin was dimly lit by the dying embers in the iron stove, casting long, dancing shadows across the wooden floorboards. In the darkest corner of the room, a shadow detached itself from the wall. Kaelen. He was no longer the fragile, shivering cub she had pulled from the ice. He had grown into a magnificent, terrifying force of nature. His thick, silver-gray coat bristled, making him look even more massive in the confined space. His amber eyes, usually so soft and observant when looking at Elara, were now narrowed, glowing with a primal, deeply ingrained instinct. He felt her tension. He smelled the foul scent of the intruders, the metallic tang of old oil, gunpowder, and violence that clung to their clothes. Kaelen let out a low, vibrating rumble that resonated in Elara's chest. It was a sound of pure warning. "Stay, my warrior," Elara whispered, her voice surprisingly steady. She placed a gentle, calming hand on his broad head. "Stay in the shadows. Let me speak to them." She wrapped her heavy fur coat tightly around her shoulders, picked up a sturdy wooden staff she used for walking, and unlatched the heavy wooden door. The freezing wind immediately rushed in, biting at her face, but she stepped out onto the small porch, closing the door firmly behind her. 3 men had stepped out of the trucks. They were large, rugged, and completely, utterly arrogant. They carried rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders, their faces half hidden by thick scarves and frost-covered beards. They moved with the heavy, entitled swagger of men who believed they owned the wilderness and everything in it. "Old woman," the lead poacher shouted over the howling wind, his voice harsh and demanding. He took heavy steps toward her porch, crushing the delicate snow under his boots. "The storm is closing the pass. We need your barn for our trucks and your fire for our bones. Move your animals out. We are taking the space." Elara stood her ground. She looked at the man, her eyes as cold and unforgiving as the ice beneath her feet. "This is my home," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the rushing wind. "My animals stay where they are. You have no right to be here. The pass is miles away. Turn back before the snow buries you." The leader laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that was swallowed by the storm. He stepped closer, stepping up onto the first wooden step of her porch. He reached out a thick, gloved hand, intent on pushing the old woman aside and forcing his way into the warmth of the cabin. "I wasn't asking for permission, grandmother," he sneered. Before his hand could even brush the fabric of her coat, the heavy wooden door behind Elara burst open with the force of an explosion. The wood splintered against the frame. From the dark interior of the cabin, Kaelen emerged. He did not run. He did not bark. He stepped out onto the porch with a terrifying, calculated slowness. The sheer size of him froze the blood in the poacher's veins. He was a giant, a mythical beast born of the frost and the shadows. His massive paws made no sound on the wooden planks. He positioned himself directly between Elara and the men, his broad chest shielding her completely. The leader stumbled backward, a gasp of pure terror escaping his lips. He slipped on the icy step and crashed hard into the snow. The other two men instinctively reached for their rifles, their hands trembling violently. But Kaelen was faster. With a speed that defied his massive size, he lunged forward, not to bite, but to dominate. He pinned the fallen leader to the frozen ground, his massive jaws snapping shut just inches from the man's throat. The sound of Kaelen's teeth clashing together was like the crack of a whip. A deep, demonic snarl erupted from the wolf's chest, a sound so loud and resonant it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" the leader screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. The hot, predatory breath of the wolf washed over his face. He could see his own death reflected in Kaelen's glowing amber eyes. Elara stepped forward, her wooden staff tapping firmly against the porch. "He remembers you," she lied, her voice chillingly calm. "He remembers the smell of the men who killed his mother. If you raise those rifles, he will tear his throat out before you can even pull the trigger, and then he will come for the rest of you." The remaining men stood frozen in the snow, their weapons half raised, their eyes wide with disbelief and terror. They were hunters, yes, but they were used to shooting from a distance, hidden behind the safety of their scopes. They were not prepared to face the raw, unchained fury of an apex predator up close. The wilderness they so casually disrespected had finally come to claim its toll. "Call him off," the leader begged, tears of fear freezing on his cheeks as Kaelen's heavy paws pressed down harder on his chest. "We are leaving. We swear it. Just call him off." Elara waited. She let the silence and the storm amplify their terror. She wanted them to understand that this valley was protected, that the weak and the discarded had found strength in each other. Finally, she softly clicked her tongue. "Kaelen, enough." Instantly, the massive wolf stepped back. He did not take his eyes off the men, his body still tense and ready to strike, but he obeyed the frail old woman implicitly. The leader scrambled to his feet, slipping and sliding in the snow, desperate to put distance between himself and the beast. He practically threw himself into the cabin of his truck. The other men followed without a single word. The engines roared to life, gears grinding in panic as the trucks violently reversed, tearing up the earth as they fled blindly back into the suffocating fog. Elara and Kaelen stood on the porch, side by side, watching until the red glow of the bay taillights disappeared completely into the whiteout. The storm immediately began to cover their tracks, erasing their existence from the valley as if they had never been there. Kaelen turned to Elara, the wild fury draining from his eyes, replaced by that familiar, gentle warmth. He nudged her hand with his cold, wet nose. She smiled, a profound sense of peace settling over her tired heart. She fell to her knees, burying her face in his thick, warm fur. They had survived. They had protected each other. But as the days turned into weeks, and the harsh grip of winter finally began to loosen, a bittersweet realization settled in Elara's heart. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth and the first delicate green shoots of spring. The frozen river cracked and roared back to life, and with the arrival of spring, the call of the wild returned, louder and more insistent than ever. At night, Kaelen would sit by the edge of the forest, his ears swiveling, listening to the complex language of the howling packs deep in the mountains. He would look back at the cabin, torn between the deep, unnatural bond he shared with the human who saved him and the ancient biological imperative that pulled him toward his own kind. Elara knew she could not be selfish. She had saved him so he could live, not so he could be a prisoner to her loneliness. One crisp, clear morning, when the sun was shining brightly over the melting snow, she walked with Kaelen to the edge of the dense pine forest. It was the furthest she had ventured from the cabin in months. She stopped at the tree line, leaning heavily on her wooden staff. Kaelen stopped beside her. He looked deep into the dark, inviting woods and then looked back at her. He whimpered softly, a sound that broke Elara's heart into 1,000 pieces. "It is time, my warrior," she said, her voice trembling slightly, tears welling in her eyes. "You belong to the forest now. You are the king of these woods. Go, find your family." She knelt down and wrapped her arms around his massive neck, burying her face in his fur one last time. She breathed in the scent of pine needles, snow, and wild freedom. Kaelen licked the tears from her wrinkled cheek, a final gesture of love and gratitude. Then, slowly, he turned away. He took a few steps into the shadows of the trees, paused, and looked back over his shoulder. Elara nodded, a sad, proud smile on her lips. With a powerful leap, Kaelen vanished into the dense undergrowth. Elara stood there for a long time, listening to the rustling leaves fade away until there was only the sound of the wind. She walked back to her cabin alone, her heart heavy, but her soul lighter than it had been in decades. She knew she was not truly alone. For the rest of her days, whenever she walked through the valley, she would sometimes find fresh meat left silently on her porch. And on the coldest, darkest nights, when the wind howled around her cabin, she would hear a deep, resonant howl from the mountain peak, a warrior's promise that she would always be protected.